Like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. And if you guessed who the killer is, write in the comments. The real triumph of justice is sometimes very far from the meaning of this phrase that arises in the head of an adequate person. It seems that sometimes law enforcement agencies are not concerned with the safety of people and victims of atrocities, but with creating favorable conditions for criminals. Donatella Colasanti was born on May 12, 1958. She grew up in a working-class family in Rome, Italy. Since childhood, she had a friend named Rosaria Lopez, who was born in 1956. The girls had known each other since childhood, lived in the same neighborhood, from families of roughly the same income. They had a lot in common. By 1975, Rosaria was 19 years old. She had already managed to get a job as a bartender, as she planned to get an education in college. She needed funds. In general, she wanted to be independent of her parents and provide for herself. It was difficult to combine work and study, but the student made every effort to do so. Her friend, at the time of the events described, was 17 years old, so she could not yet be fully employed. The girls spent a lot of time together, had been friends since childhood. They also had common friends, one of whom turned out to be Gian Pietro Boni. On September 20th, 1975, he invited them to a bar where they planned to relax and meet his friends. Here, Gian met his friends named Angelo Izzo, who was 20 years old, and Giovanni Guido, who had turned 19. The group spent that evening at the establishment. The girls liked the young men whom their mutual friend had introduced them to. The guys told them about another mutual friend of theirs who, at the last moment, could not make it to this party. The guys suggested the girls meet at another party to get to know this friend and chat more closely. They decided not to waste time, and the meeting was scheduled for the next day, September 29th, at the house of their mutual friend, Gian Pietro Boni. Despite the fleeting acquaintance, the young men appealed to the girls so much. They looked decent and harmless, so both agreed to join the planned celebration. On September 29th, 1975, the girls met Angelo and Giovanni near a cinema called Abbazia. At 3:30 p.m., their mutual acquaintance John did not show up for the meeting. The guys said that John's plans had supposedly changed a bit and he was waiting for them at his house. Donatella and Rosaria, suspecting nothing amiss, agreed to go with them. The girls trusted these guys. Giovanni turned in a different direction along the way, but initially, the girls didn't notice this, as they didn't know the exact route. At 6:20 p.m., the group of young people arrived at a villa called Circeo, located on the coast of Circeo in the Punta Rossa area. This place was about 100 kilometers south of Rome. The villa belonged to the family of a friend of the young men named Andrea Ghira, who was 22 years old at the time. The guys convinced the girls that this was where they were supposed to meet that same mutual friend and owner of the villa, who hadn't been able to join the party at the bar the day before. And Gian was supposedly swimming in the sea and would return to them soon. The guys were so polite and courteous that the girls believed them. It is worth noting that all the young men came from respectable families. In addition, they all used pseudonyms. Why this lie was necessary became known much later, when the girls were already trapped. Giovanni Guido was born on January 10, 1956. He was the son of a wealthy official at the time of the events described. The young man was studying at the architectural faculty of the local university and lived with his parents. Angelo Izzo was born on August 23, 1955, into a middle-class family. He lived in Rome. At the age of 13, he became a member of a social movement. He held far-right views and was considered cruel and aggressive. Members of the community feared him when he was angry, as Angelo had absolutely no self-control. At the end of 1969, he and his friend Andrea Ghira were expelled from this group. This was because they tried to use the house where the movement was based to hide stolen mopeds there. This was not the first incident that could have damaged the entire organization. In subsequent years, he became even more violent. His list of criminal exploits was supplemented by many episodes. The young man repeatedly organized attacks on the Italian Socialist Party, along with other right-wing young men from Rome. In addition, he distributed illegal substances, which he himself willingly used. He repeatedly committed robberies of banks, jewelry stores, and post offices. Most terrifyingly for Donatella and Rosaria, Angelo Izzo had repeatedly participated in gang rapes of girls. The modus operandi was the same each time and worked flawlessly. They would meet girls through mutual friends, then lure them into a house where they would brutally abuse them. In 1975, Angelo became a medical student. But the criminal world attracted the aspiring criminal more. The young man often skipped classes and instead attended parties and bars, moved in dubious circles, and provoked fights with rival groups. His favorite places for parties were events that activists of these organizations held in their homes. Here, real debauchery took place with alcohol, illegal substances, and political and ideological movements, which almost always included the rape and abuse of women. This was precisely the reason why the boys gave the girls pseudonyms instead of their real names, so that they could not find out how serious the danger threatening them was. Back in 1970, Angelo raped 2 women along with accomplices. The criminal was even caught. He was put on trial, but received only a 2.5-year suspended sentence. It was believed that his father's money and his connections in high circles played a large role in this. Of course, impunity made him increasingly cruel. He feared nothing. Andrea Guerra's life was no less eventful. He was born on September 21, 1953. His father was a building contractor, the owner of a factory producing electrical equipment, a fairly wealthy man. He also played water polo and at a professional level. Together with the Italian national team, he won many medals. However, his son was more attracted not to career and sports achievements, but to the far-right political movement. He became involved in it while still in high school. Already in these years, he became the organizer of a group whose main task was to commit crimes. Andrea regarded such activities as one of the tools of social influence, a way to assert himself and promote the movement. From the age of 16, the guy had serious problems with the law. In particular, in 1970, he was caught for several episodes of hooliganism. All this was just the beginning. His ideology was largely based on the legend of the so-called Circeo clan. He often called himself by the pseudonym Jacques. As one of the leaders of the group, the real Jacques was known for carrying out several kidnappings in Rome to extort money. It was under this name that Andrea Guerra introduced himself to his new acquaintances. He first received official charges for hooliganism, but already in 1972, this list was supplemented by armed assault and infliction of grievous bodily harm. A year later, together with his friend Angelo Izzo, he committed an armed robbery for which the young men were caught and even sentenced to 5 years in prison. Unfortunately, money, connections, and an overly lenient justice system played their part here. Only 2 years later, both were released. Unfortunately, the girls did not suspect how dangerous the young men who lured them to the party were. Despite the friendly conversation and pleasant appearance, their intentions were not good from the very beginning. For the first few hours at this villa, everything went well. The young people talked, listened to music, and drank. Then the guys reached a high stage of alcohol intoxication, used illegal substances, became noticeably ruder and more aggressive, and grew bolder. Angelo and Giovanni began to harass the girls. At first, they considered it a joke and simply refused. But when the girls realized the full danger of the situation, it was too late. They had nowhere to run. Nevertheless, Donatella and Rosaria refused to voluntarily engage in sexual intercourse with them and begged to be allowed to go home. Then one of the criminals pulled out a gun and pointed it at them, saying that he was a member of a Marseille criminal gang. According to the guy, the head of the organization ordered their kidnapping. Naturally, at gunpoint, the girls' will was broken without much difficulty. Then real hell began. Donatella and Rosaria were subjected to torture and multiple rapes by Giovanni and Angelo. They were beaten and tortured, threatened with weapons. Later, the owner of the villa, Andrea, joined them. He also participated in all the torture and violence, which lasted for about 36 hours before this brutal crime reached its denouement. The girls were drugged with illegal substances. Rosaria was taken to an upstairs bathroom. Here, the girl was once again subjected to a brutal beating, and after that, they began to drown her until she lost consciousness. they tried to strangle Donatella with a belt. Several times, they brought her to the point of losing consciousness, but did not kill her. They simply tormented her. When her friend died, the criminals clearly had no intention of leaving her alive. However, at some point, they lost interest and got distracted, leaving her unconscious in the living room. The girl regained consciousness and tried to take advantage of the situation. She decided to get to the phone to call for help. Donatella began to dial the emergency number, but just as the dial tone sounded in the receiver, one of the criminals entered the room. She didn't manage to say a word and received a blow to the head with a heavy object. The killer grabbed the first thing that came to hand. It was an iron metal rod. Donatella fell, bleeding profusely. She showed no more signs of life. Now the killers decided to get rid of the bodies. They wrapped the girls in towels and a blanket, then in bags, and carried them to a white Fiat that was parked outside in the villa's courtyard. They threw them into the trunk, after which the criminals got into the car and drove towards Rome. Obviously, they felt no remorse, as they laughed merrily and joked along the way about the 2 dead bodies in the car. Finally, the company reached Andrea Ghira's house, located in the city. They were hungry, so before getting rid of the bodies, they decided to go to a restaurant for dinner. They left the car parked on the street. When the killers entered the restaurant, they met 2 other guys who were members of another movement. A fight broke out between them, provoked by the story's heroes. It seemed as if they had forgotten that there were 2 bodies in the trunk of the car. They didn't care, as if nothing unusual had happened. The trio of criminals had no idea that Donatella Colasanti was actually alive all this time. After being hit on the head with a metal rod, the girl pretended to be dead to stop the beating. And it worked. As soon as Donatella realized that the criminals had left the car, she waited a bit to make sure they had moved away. Then Donatella began to scream and thrash about in the trunk with all her might. Despite being beaten and in severe pain, the victim spared no last effort. It was around 11 p.m. There were few people on the street. The chances of someone hearing her seemed low. But she was very lucky, as a security guard was nearby, and the noise coming from the trunk of the car attracted his attention. The elderly man listened, saw blood near the car, and then quickly approached a police car, a patrol of which was stationed nearby at that time. This was another fortunate coincidence that saved the victim's life. As the young men were about to return, communicating by radio, the patrol car transmitted the information. During this period, a journalist who was interested in the case and was nearby overheard the radio wave. Realizing that something serious had happened, he rushed to the scene. The man arrived on time. Law enforcement officers were already there, trying to open the trunk. The captive's screams could still be heard from inside. Upon opening the car, they found a bloodied, naked girl inside. Badly beaten with a swollen face, she needed medical attention. Next to her lay Rosaria's lifeless body. In the hospital, she was diagnosed with several serious injuries, including a traumatic brain injury and a broken nose from the blow with the metal rod. All this time, Donatella had been in the trunk, lying on the body of her deceased friend. The horror she endured caused serious psychological trauma. Donatella struggled with the consequences for a long time, but never fully recovered. While she was in the medical facility, the girl feared that the criminals would return to eliminate her as an unwanted witness and could barely sleep. Even after being discharged, it didn't get any easier. She still feared revenge from the boys. Giovanni, seeing the crowd of people around his car, tried to flee but was apprehended. Angelo was also handcuffed. Only Andrea was warned, so he managed to escape. The criminal was put on the wanted list, but the next day, the Carabinieri managed to find the fugitive's relatives, who were cleaning the house of blood. According to the authorities, his mother and brother were covering for him, trying to hide evidence. They did not report the boy's whereabouts. It was suggested that he had warned them about what had happened and asked for help to hide. Unfortunately, it worked. His relatives bought time and the trail went cold. The criminal's friends were arrested during this time. They were interrogated about the attack on the girls, but they stubbornly denied guilt. Several months passed. Andrea had still not been caught during this period, not even his location determined. Suddenly, his friends received a letter in which he assured them that for good behavior, they should soon be released, as Andrea had arranged everything with the mafia. Furthermore, he wrote that the surviving girl would soon die if she was determined to testify against them in court. All this only increased the pressure on the victim. However, Donatella was not going to back down and remain silent. She wanted revenge for her friend's death and her own suffering. The girl had miraculously survived. She realized that without the capture of the criminals, she still would not be able to live peacefully, fearing their return. Thanks to Donatella's words, the Carabinieri managed to almost completely reconstruct the picture of the crime committed by the group of young men at the country villa. However, the victim's lawyer believed that the trio of rapists and murderers had a chance to escape punishment thanks to the influence of their parents. It was necessary to give this case maximum publicity. Therefore, a group of like-minded volunteers against the criminals was formed, headed by Donatella's lawyer. In addition, several feminist organizations were present at the trial as a support group. Thanks to their active efforts, as well as Donatella's courage, on July 29, 1976, all three were found guilty of first-degree murder and attempted murder. Angelo, Guido, and Andrea were sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Moreover, Andrea was still at large all this time, had not yet been caught, and received his sentence in absentia. All this did little to reassure Donatella. The girl was very afraid of the criminal's return and revenge from his side, as Andrea was still at large. The police desperately continued to search for him, but without success. Years later, which Donatella spent in fear and attempts to influence the work of the law enforcement system, the Carabinieri managed to find out that Andrea Ghira had fled to Spain almost immediately after the murder. On June 26, 1976, he joined the Spanish Legion, using the fictitious pseudonym Massimo Test Andres. He claimed to have been born in Rome in 1955. He even provided a fake document. All of this worked. During his service, the guy changed several bases. He actively used and distributed illegal substances. Thus, a severe drug addiction developed. The consequences of systematic use became increasingly noticeable. For assault and distribution of illegal substances, on May 28, 1980, he ended up in prison for 6 months. In 1982, he was sent to Malaga, to the Special Forces, then to the police. Here, Andrea was repeatedly brought to justice for the use and possession of illegal substances. On July 22, 1993, he began to have health problems. At first, Andrea was hospitalized. The serviceman was diagnosed with a brain tumor. He was discharged due to an unsatisfactory mental state, as well as numerous physical problems. He did not have a passport, so Andrea settled in the city of his last deployment with his girlfriend. The girl had her own small shop. The guy quickly squandered everything he had earned during his service. The criminal continued to use illegal drugs due to an overdose. On September 2nd, Andrea Ghira passed away. His body was found only a week later, on September 9th, as he was no longer living with his girlfriend. When the complicated story of this deceitful and dangerous man was revealed in 2005, the Rome prosecutor's office requested an exhumation of the body. On November 14th of the same year, this request was granted. Andrea was exhumed in the presence of local investigators, and then a femur was delivered to Rome for analysis. On November 26th of the same year, a DNA test confirmed his identity. However, the results of these tests raised great doubts, as it was conducted by a former student, a relative of the criminal on his mother's side. Because of this, Donatella believed that the bone belonged to one of his relatives, and Andrea himself was actually still alive and continuing to commit his dark deeds in Rome or another city. No explanations worked. The girl still had not recovered from the horror she had experienced and wanted to make sure that she was not in danger. To dispel all doubts, in January 2016, the Rome prosecutor's office reopened the investigation. The body was exhumed again to conduct a more thorough DNA test using advanced techniques in another laboratory. In June of the same year, a report was received that confirmed the results of the previous analysis of the femur. This meant that Andrea Ghira had indeed died and no longer posed a threat to her. The fate of Angelo and Guido was also eventful, despite their imprisonment. In January 1977, the pair of criminals attempted to escape from the prison where they were being held. In doing so, they took one of the prison guards hostage. Fortunately, their plan was foiled. In January 1986, Angelo made another attempt. At this time, he was in another correctional facility. Despite all these violations and escape attempts, on August 25th of that year, Angelo took advantage of a relaxation of the strictness of his confinement. He received the right to be released briefly and did not return to prison. Instead, he fled to France. Already on September 15th, the criminal was caught in Paris and extradited back. Each such incident caused real terror for the heroine of the story. She had miraculously survived the criminal's attack. Now she didn't know who would finish her off faster, Andrea, whose whereabouts were unknown, or one of these fugitives. In December 2004, Angelo Izzo gained complete freedom, but his true nature had not changed. Only 5 months passed after this, when, on April 28, 2005, his next victims were 14-year-old Valentina Majorano and her 49-year-old mother, Maria Carmela. Both were killed. First, Angelo attacked the woman, then turned to her daughter. Just like 30 years ago, Angelo packed the bodies in bags, but this time he learned from his mistakes and buried the victims immediately, giving them no chance of survival. On April 30th, this crime was solved thanks to the confession of the criminal's accomplice. For the confession, the accomplice received only 3 years in prison. Investigators believed that this crime was sexually motivated, as the girl was undressed, unlike her mother. Angelo himself claimed that the motive for the crime was robbery. He attacked the woman who refused to give him valuables and money, and got rid of her daughter as an unwanted witness. Later, detectives began to lean towards the theory that this attack on the woman and her daughter was revenge against his former cellmate, who turned out to be an active member of another group. For the double murder, Angelo was again sentenced to life imprisonment. On January 12, 2007, Maria and Valentina's relatives believed that the system was to blame for everything, as it had released a dangerous monster onto the city streets. After all, Angelo was incorrigible, and this was obvious to everyone. If he had been in prison, the victims would not have suffered. The family of the murdered appealed to the European Court of Human Rights on December 15, 2009. The court found Italy guilty of violating Article 2 of the European Convention on Human Rights for granting semi-liberty to Angelo, a prisoner sentenced to life. The Strasbourg court ruled that the Italian authorities had violated the right to life of Maria Carmela and Valentina Majorano, killed by Angelo when he was at liberty. The judge explained that the protection of the right to life obliges states not only to refrain from causing death voluntarily and unlawfully, but also to take necessary measures to protect persons under their jurisdiction. The court found that granting semi-liberty to such a dangerous criminal and the lack of supervision over him had effectively led to the deaths of 2 people. As a result of the court's decision, the Italian authorities had to compensate the victims' families €45,000 for moral damages. Despite his bloody rampage, there were supporters who romanticized his image. For example, in November 2009, a journalist who had been closely following Angelo's criminal activities announced that she wanted to marry him and fight for his freedom. The journalist was convinced of his innocence and was determined to prove it. In March 2010, they married right in prison, but the relationship ended about a year later. Trying to achieve another mitigation of punishment, Angelo made a statement before the Anti-Mafia Commission. He spoke about a girl named Rossella Corazzin, who disappeared on August 21, 1975, at the age of 17. According to the defendant, she attracted the attention of a Masonic lodge due to her innocence and sweet appearance, and was used for a sacrifice in an initiation ceremony of the Red Roses and Golden Cross Brotherhood. He personally last saw her when, after the end of the Masonic ritual, the girl was released from the hall. Angelo was sure that her body could be found in the forest, but nothing of the sort was found. No one believed his words. During his imprisonment, he wrote several manuscripts, including a book called Decameron 1075. This so-called novel was painfully reminiscent of the gruesome event involving 3 criminals and 2 girls, Donatella and Rosaria, one of whom did not survive the attack. Giovanni Guido's prison sentence was changed after a successful appeal on October 28, 1980. Now he was to serve only 30 years in prison. Such a reduction was achieved thanks to a statement of remorse, as well as compensation of 100 million lire to the families of Rosaria and Donatella. Already in January 1981, he escaped from prison and went to Buenos Aires. However, he was quickly recognized here. This happened a little less than 2 years later. The fugitive was arrested. He was awaiting extradition, but ended up in a medical center due to hepatitis. It was believed that he contracted this disease during his imprisonment several years before his escape. Taking advantage of the situation, on April 17, 1985, he escaped from the medical institution without waiting for extradition. He was next tracked down in Panama in the summer of 1994. Here he was leading a new life, far from crime, and had become a used car salesman. When the man was recognized, he was extradited back to Italy. Surprisingly, on April 11, 2008, Giovanni Guido's sentence was commuted to community service. By this point, he had spent 14 years behind bars. During this period, he received an education, a degree in foreign languages and literature. His punishment ended on August 25, 2009. Such a significant reduction in sentence became possible after a pardon. Rosaria Lopez's sister reacted particularly negatively to this decision by the authorities. The woman believed that the regime in which the brutal murderer was held was not strict enough. In addition, the family remained convinced that the criminal felt no remorse for the atrocities committed. It is obvious that the many years spent abroad after his escape were not taken into account at all. Despite this, the decision and attempts to challenge the pardon were refused review. The villa that became the scene of the crime is now uninhabited. Andrea Guerra's mother sold the house 25 years later to an elderly woman. Then the villa passed to her son. He tried to turn the house, which is considered a house of horrors, into a studio, but eventually abandoned the idea. Now the villa is abandoned, the gates are rusty, and weeds have almost swallowed the plot. A memorial plaque and red benches, symbolizing the fight against gender-based violence, were installed at the place where 17-year-old Donatella was freed. At that time, rape was considered a crime against morality, not against the person. 50 years have passed, and thanks to public efforts, the situation has changed. Now, sexually motivated crimes are considered crimes against the person. Against this backdrop, the fate of the survivor, Donatella Colasanti, looks much more tragic. Even as a minor, she miraculously survived the attack of these 3 monsters, then spent her whole life in fear, but never stopped fighting. She died on December 30th, 2005 from breast cancer. At that moment, she was 47 years old. As her last statement, she declared the call, "Let's fight for the truth." In 2020, her old house was restored. It became a center for combating violence in Rome. If you liked my work, subscribe to the channel. Support this video with likes. Let's discuss this story in the comments.